shapes and changing names. He's working hard to rig the game. Oh no, oh no. Old Jim Crow, get your dirty fingers out of the ballot box right now. Jim Crow's fine words are just a disguise for rich men's greed and dirty lies. Divide and conquer, ever and none, makes black, white, brown the devil's pawn. Oh no, oh no. Old Jim Crow, get your dirty fingers out of the ballot box right now. You might think that if you're white, everything will be alright. But inch by inch and row by row, he'll rob you too, leave you with bones. Oh no, oh no. Old Jim Crow, get your dirty fingers out of the ballot box right now. Jim Crow makes laws to take our votes, crying fraud and blowing smoke. A vote is such a little thing, but pile them up and let freedom ring. Oh no, oh no. Old Jim Crow, let your dirty fingers out of the ballot box right now. We'll go much farther together, I know, than we ever will alone. Old Jim Crow tries to bring us down, but he's not the only game in town. Oh no, oh no. Old Jim Crow, get your dirty fingers out of the ballot box right now. I said, oh no, oh no. Old Jim Crow, get your dirty fingers out of the ballot box right now.
Welcome back. Thanks to Maggie for her wonderful hosting this morning for our International Human Rights Panel Plenary. And thank you for joining us on the main stage for the domestic plenary, focused on the fierce urgency of voting rights protection. As you learned in the International Human Rights Plenary this morning, EAD directs its opening worship and conference offering to support the issues we are advocating for during the conference. Our domestic offering recipient is Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute. Look at this short presentation to learn more about the Capacity Building Institute's ongoing efforts to address challenges to voting rights, fair representation, and voter access.
When I say love, you say power. Love. Power. Love. Power.
This is day 3 of the Selma to Montgomery March. I'm going through Lowndes County, raising issues around voting rights, student debt cancellation, housing issues, police violence, healthcare, COVID relief. All of that comes through our voting rights.
You got a right to vote. You got a right to vote.
We actually have a 10-mile walk that we're doing today for the Selma to Montgomery March. We're commemorating the 57th anniversary that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. We want voting rights now. We don't want war. We want peace now.
Show me what democracy looks like.
This is what democracy looks like. Hey, hey.
Say hi, y'all. Let's get ready to go. This march is about keeping that excitement over because some people trying to tell us that the voting rights movement is dead because there was a vote a month or two ago. It ain't dead. We just getting started.
Come on, join and be a part of this mighty army of 1 million people who are standing in alignment with the vision that we're going to make the America that we desire and we deserve.
The opportunity to give is available at advocacydays.org/offering. advocacydays.org/offering. And after today's session, you will understand how important it is to support their efforts in a meaningful way. Now, we are excited to have a member of our EAD Executive Committee serve as moderator for this important conversation today. Aligned with our support of voting rights for every U.S. citizen, please welcome Reverend Andrea Alexander, Associate General Secretary for Action and Advocacy, the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA. We appreciate their taking the lead in planning this component of the national gathering. Reverend Alexander.
Good afternoon, our EAD family and friends who've been with us for many years. And welcome to this session. As noted, the theme this year, The Fierce Urgency of Now, comes from Dr. King's last book that was actually published posthumously, always hard to say that word, Where Do We Go From Here? And he talks about the fierce urgency and now, and he concludes that it is our choice between chaos and community. And so I thank you for joining us this afternoon, where our plenary speaker will be none other than Cliff Albright, co-founder of Black Voters Matters Fund and Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute. When we think of the civil rights movement, the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and the Edmund Pettus Bridge are images ingrained in our minds. Imagine what viewing that from an historic lens must have been like for our speaker today, a former resident of Selma and part of a generation for which this past became prologue. Cliff Albright is a 2020 Soros Equity Fellow and co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund, MVBVM, and Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute, which builds community and organizational capacity related to Black voting power. BVM received national attention in 2017 when they helped mobilize Black voters during the U.S. Senate race between Doug Jones and Ray Moore. Since then, Cliff and the BVM team have traveled throughout 20 primarily Southern states in the blackest bus in America, energizing voters and exposing voter suppression. He and his team recently played a critical role in the 2020 election cycle, including the historic Georgia runoff elections for U.S. Senate. Cliff served as an instructor of African American studies at several universities, and his writings are included in 3 books, most recently, The Black Agenda. Mr. Albright has attributed articles to and featured on CNN, MSNBC, ABC, BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, Politico, and more. During his time in Selma, Cliff focused on bringing financial resources to Alabama's Black Belt region. He is a graduate of Cornell University, where he earned a Bachelor's of Science in Applied Economics and an MPS in African Studies. He also has an MBA from the University of Alabama. That's his written bio. But I have been blessed to stand shoulder to shoulder with this brother. He is a man of faith. He is a warrior for justice. And as people will say, he's the real deal in these social justice streets. So join me in giving a warm EAD welcome to Cliff Albright. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, for that introduction, and of course for all the work that you've been doing. Because as you said, you've been out there standing, side by side, marching step by step, at the White House, at the Senate, and other places. So thank you so much for everything
in
that
jail.
You've been doing.
No,
that's right. In jail. That's right. That's right.
And that's the fierce urgency of now. Sometimes the fierce urgency of now will land you up getting arrested and going to jail. So again, thank you.
So I'm gonna just ask you to open, bear, and just be yourself. Family, I actually talked briefly to Mr. Albright and was like, look, you do this thing, you know this. We are in a state right now, states, as in 50 of them, of conundrum. And voting rights are at the very core of our democracy. I would go so far as to say for the United States, it is a core of acknowledging our humanity. Everyone being created in the image of God and how that lives itself out. So I just ask you to open up and just share with us your understanding of voting and its under this theme of fierce urgency of now, and you and so many others, including your colleague and partner in this struggle, Latasha Brown, know all too well.
Yeah, no, definitely. And thank you for framing it that way, because I think that's the important thing when we have to think about the importance of voting rights is what you were saying, that this is about our humanity, right? This isn't just, sometimes people try to approach the issue of voting rights as if it's this side issue, that it's, one of many other things, that it's equivalent to, tax reform or some other issues or some other policy type things. But no, this is a moral issue, right? This is about our humanity. This is about love for each other. One of the things that I often talk about, voting rights is not a victimless crime, right? Like, there's all this discussion right now about the increase of violent crime in the country, and you got the boogeyman of violent crime, and people act like that's the only type of crime that is violent, right? But the reality is, and I say this all the time, voter suppression is a violent crime. It's not a white collar crime. It's not a victimless crime. Voter suppression is a violent crime because it has violent impacts in our lives. If we didn't know that before COVID, then we need to know that now, right? If we didn't know the ways that voter suppression contributes to leadership or a lack of leadership that can literally be a matter of life or death, we have lost hundreds of thousands of people because you have people in some states and at the national level during the first year or so of the pandemic who didn't care about life, right? Who only cared about the politics of it. Voter suppression is a violent crime. If we look at the impacts that it's having, if we look at the state of Florida, look at the impact that voter suppression is having on our LGBT community, right? Or on others who are marginalized, who are made to feel unwelcome, even within their own schools. Those who can be taken away from family members just because of who they are, right? That has a violent impact in our lives. We look at the impact that voter suppression has on every issue, on immigration, on housing. Ask Texas whether or not voter suppression is a victimless crime when you look at the things that their governor is doing there, whether you're looking at the lives that were lost because of the ineffective energy policy and the freeze and a complete unwillingness to deal with that. They'd rather be dealing with a woman and her choices and arresting doctors than dealing with repairing a grid that literally led people to lose their lives in the midst of winter. Voter suppression is a violent crime. This is not a choice between parties. This is not a choice between policies. This is a choice between right and wrong. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's a choice between good or evil. When we look at the evil things that are being done in spite of, or in the name of democracy, but really, in fact, it goes against everything that democracy stands for. It goes against everything that love stands for. This is a moral call that we're making in this time. And we've got to understand that, because if we don't, then we can't adequately connect voting rights to all of the other issues that people care deeply about, whether it's housing or whether it's health or whether it's education or whether it's the economy and inflation. What we've got to see is voting rights and our democracy is the thing that gives us the power. It gives voice to our ability to impact whatever other issue it is that we're passionate about, whatever other people it is in our lives that we're passionate about, that we love. Without our voting rights, none of that can get very far.
Yeah. you've said so much in that little bitty piece. Um, it resonated so deeply in the analogy of voting suppression is a violent crime. Can you talk a little bit about organizing methods and getting the message? Because that's something that I've talked to people about. For instance, if you have issues, like people always say, I've heard so many people say things like, all things are local, all politics is local. Yes and no, in that your local issue of everything from if your trash is going to be picked up, what's happening in your school, on your school board, and in your school with your children. But when it comes to things like access to universal health care or local policing versus how the national government provides resources to your police force by giving them, how many people live in their neighborhoods? And I think of people in Ferguson, and I've seen police tanks in the street.
That's right.
So
That's right.
talk to our audience a little bit about how they can be the voice of making those connections. So often people want to do something, but then again, one of the reasons we're in the place that we are is there's so much focus on the national elections that we have not been able to connect that issue to what's happening in our home and in our neighborhood.
Right. No, you're exactly right. All politics is local, but we have to, even though we may be thinking locally, we got to recognize that there's also a national and a federal dimension to all of these issues that we're talking about. And the challenge is to be able to take action, to be able to organize at each of those levels, at the local level, at the city council and the mayor's level, at the county commission level, at the state level, and yes, at the federal level. There's really no issue that we can think about that doesn't touch on each of those issues. I think you gave the perfect example of police violence, right? Yes, that's a matter of, well, who's your police chief, right? And who's the mayor appointing the police chief, and the city council, and who's the DA that makes decisions about whether or not to prosecute, right? All of that matters at the local level. We got to be engaged at that level. But at the end of the day, we also got to be engaged at the federal level, right? We need a federal law that deals with, and we had an opportunity in terms of the George Floyd Policing Act, right? But that fell apart. And so, but we need federal action the same way we need, even at the executive level, you can have federal action. You had the Obama White House and even now the Biden White House that has been more active at investigating and doing consent decrees with local police departments, right? And so that just taking that one issue, you can see how it's an issue that affects both at the local level, the state level, and at the federal level. And all these issues that we're talking about, it's the same thing. Healthcare, same thing, right? Who's in charge locally? Who's making decisions at the county level or at the state level about like which hospitals are getting closed and which roads get support in order to get you to the hospital? All that matters at the local level, but federal legislation matters. So all of this, we've got to be engaged at each of these levels. And the challenge is, to get connected to organizations that are doing this work. That are doing the work around this policy, around these policy issues, but also getting connected to the organizations that are trying to get voters out, that are trying to have the conversations that need to be had in order to make this more clear to people. The part of the problem with this electoral system is that too often we skip over folks. We view folks as not being important for that conversation because they're not a super voter. How many candidates and how many of the parties and other organizations, y'all have seen people walking door to door and knocking on doors and giving out information. How many times have you seen these folks that'll go past a house, sometimes going past an entire block or an entire neighborhood, sometimes skipping an entire apartment building? Why? Because, those folks, what are they? They're low propensity voters. They're not super voters, right? They're irregular voters. Whatever the terminology is, when we walk past them, we send a message that they don't matter. And so if Black voters and all voters, any marginalized voters, but particularly Black voters from our experience are going to matter, we've got to be willing to have those conversations, right? We've got to be willing to pull people into this process, not just a one-way conversation in a way where we're just giving information, but it's got to be a two-way conversation. You've got to believe that at every door that you go to and in every conversation that you have, that's a learning opportunity. people think that organizing is about how well you talk, and I preach this, that organizing is about how well you listen, because when we really listen to people and then engage them in discussions, that's how you pull in people who have been disengaged from this process. Every year we talk about, these two parties and which one's going to get the most vote. But at the end of the day, the biggest party, the biggest block of voters out there are the voters that are choosing none of the above. Right? Because in some elections, even presidential, that might be 30% of the potential registered voters that are just not participating. Not to mention if it's not a presidential year, or if it's just a local election, we've seen cities and counties where sometimes the turnout rate is only in double digits, barely 10%, 15%, 20%. That means you've got a huge block of people that are not engaged. We've got to be willing to have those conversations. But this brings us right back to voting rights. Because at the end of the day, the attack against voting rights isn't just an attack against individuals. What we are seeing increasingly is that these are attacks against the organizations that do this work to pull more people into the process, whether it's organizations like in Georgia, whether it's us or New Georgia Project, or in some of the other states. What they're doing, even if you look at the laws that they're passing, they're not just criminalizing individual voters. Yes, they're doing that, but they're also criminalizing organizations that are trying to do large-scale voter registration drives. Right? In Florida, we just beat the state of Florida in a litigation dealing with their voter suppression law. Right? Scraped the floor with them. Right? The judge came back with such a strong ruling. He said, not only are you banned from doing these voter suppression tactics, he said, but now if you try to do anything like this for the next 10 years, you've got to get it pre-cleared. That's how gross voter suppression was in Florida. But one of the things that we fought was that they had this requirement that groups, when they were trying to register people, they had to tell them, oh, by the way, if you get registered with me, then there's a chance that your vote may not count. Now, what is the impact of a policy like that going to be? I don't care how trustworthy you are, how much of a credible messenger you are. If you have to tell that to every voter that you're trying to get to fill out a registration form, that person's going to look at you kind of suspicious, kind of side eye. And so, but they knew that would be the impact. And then they try to criminalize organizations if they don't get things in on time, if they don't follow certain procedures. So the attacks of voter suppression aren't just attacks on individual voters. They are attacks on the very organizations whose mission it is to pull more people into this process that we call democracy. That's what these attacks are all about. And that's not even to get to the other part of the suppression. There's a whole spectrum of suppression. There's the suppression of the voters. There's the suppression of the organizations that do this work. Then there's the suppression of the entire notion of democracy itself. That's the election subversion piece, right? Where they say, look, even if we mess up and you get to register, which we didn't want you to register, but you registered. And then we didn't want you to vote, but somehow you found a way to vote. You found the drop box, or you found a way to do early voting, whatever. And even if we mess up and somehow these organizations that we're trying to criminalize and trying to put them out of business and make their jobs, even if they somehow do their job and work a miracle, and even if y'all win an election and vote for the candidates of your choice, guess what? We got a fail proof. We're going to come back and take over boards of elections, and we're going to decide whether or not this election even counts. That's what they're trying to do in states like Georgia and Florida and Texas, where they're trying to control the very process of whether or not the entire election gets to count. And so this is the thing that we're up against. That's why this fierce urgency of now is so critically important. This isn't a story that we're seeing on TV about some dystopian future, right? Some post-apocalypse zombie, lack of democracy and lack of governance. These are things that are happening right now. Again, look at the state of Florida. I hate to keep talking about Florida, but the governor is just so crazy. I got to keep talking about him. But look at the state of Florida and what they just did when they just passed these illegal maps, which we're also suing about. They just passed these maps, these racist maps that literally take away two predominantly Black congressional districts. But look what the Black legislators did. They launched a protest in the chambers, protesting that the legislature was about to pass these maps. But as they were doing so, what did they do? They cut off the internet. Right. And where do we see actions like that? Where do we see governments, authoritarian governments, cutting off internet access in order to hide what's going on, right? So they cut off the internet, and then what did they do? They kicked out journalists. Where else do we see that type of action? Kicking out journalists, arresting journalists, right? In some cases, you know, again, I don't want to be hyperbolic, but in some cases, even killing journalists. But where do we see those types of actions, right? This is not something that you're supposed to see in what's supposed to be the world's greatest democracy. This is not something that we're reading about or that we're seeing in some sci-fi movie. These are things that are happening right now. And if we don't meet this with a fierce urgency of now, if we don't meet it with the same type of urgency that those folks that you mentioned in Selma had in 65, and I'm going to talk about 65 versus what came before 65, but if we don't match it with the same sense of urgency that those like John Lewis and Amelia Boynton and Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others showed when they were fighting for the Voting Rights Act to begin with, then we're going to wake up and find out that we don't have this democracy. It's never been a perfect democracy, to be clear. It's never been what it claimed to be. But for whatever it is and for whatever it's worth, it is not out of thought that we can wake up one day and it no longer exists. Those are the types of actions that we're seeing place right now. The good news is we've done it before and we'll do it again.
Okay. One of the things that I want is to address a very practical issue. People are on this screen right now looking at you. They've seen you on television and you're speaking, and you know, I don't have your public presence, but you know, maybe an ask or see someone like myself doing this at this national level and so forth. We didn't wake up one day and end up doing this kind of work. I know one of my very first public protest action was a high school student speaking out because the teachers went on strike, and we were like, hey, you know, it's been good to be out of school for a little while, but we need to get back in school. So we took over the public library and stayed overnight as a protest action. But my big public expression of prophetic action came marching with Reverend Jesse Jackson to get registered to vote. And my very first opportunity to vote in a national election, I went with my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother had grown up and lived in Mississippi where she had not had a right to vote. So it was a generation, like in space and time, to be with someone who had that experience. People want to know how to start. You know, they're thinking like, I can't do that. I won't, you know, that's Black Voters Matter, and that's Cliff Albright, and that's like the everyday person sitting in their house looking at this going, I just feel lost. This fierce urgency now is actually more overwhelming than it is an urgency to do something. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it brings a couple of things to mind, right? One is, you know, start where you are, right? Start with, you know, you, your family, your friends, you know, a couple of people that are like-minded. You know, there's a positive and a negative side to the fierce urgency of now, right? The positive side is that, you know, it communicates that we've got to take action, right? That we've got to do something, right? The downside, or the risk, I'll say, is that too often, I think you phrased it well, too often when people hear the fierce urgency of now, they think that right now I've got to have the March on Washington. Right now, I've got to have the Selma to Montgomery march, right? And I hate to tell you, it's not going to start that way, right? It didn't start that way for me. It didn't start that way for Dr. King or Fannie Lou or any of our other historic icons, right? But it starts with an idea. It starts with the belief. It starts with a moral call, and then you take action on it, right? And so, where can you start? You can start by getting connected to any number of organizations in your community that you know is doing good work, right? And whether that's NAACP, League of Women's Voters, the local neighborhood association, right? Anybody that's already active in this space that you can get connected, right? We've got to organize. But you can even start even smaller than that. You can just do something on your own. You can have a house party where you're just talking about these issues and trying to encourage other people to to get more involved. I'll never forget our first fundraiser for Black Voters Matter. It was long before there was the Blackest Bus in America. It was long before the Georgia race or the Alabama Senate race of 2017. It started in 2016 at a parent social at one of my children's high school events. And I was telling people, hey, you know, this election's coming up, and we're trying to go to a rural county in Georgia. It was the first county where we did work, Sumter County, Georgia, in middle, southwest Georgia. And I was saying, yeah, you know, I'm trying to get there, trying to get some signs, trying to get some shirts so that we can do some voter outreach. And we don't have the resources. And one of the parents there said, you know, how much would you need? And I said, well, you know, we could do a lot with a little in this time we have. I said $1,000, and we could have a dent. And he said, you know, give me an hour. And he went around talking to parents and telling them, hey, this is one of our parents, and this is what he's trying to do, right? He's trying to mobilize voters, and they just need, you know, a few dollars to make that happen. And by the end of that night, I had the $1,000 that was necessary. That was literally Black Voters Matter's first fundraiser. And with that $1,000, we went down to Sumter County, and we wound up mobilizing Black voters and changing the course of the election in that one county, right? And so I'm saying all this to say is that for you listening, it can be that small. It could be something at your house. It could be a local march, like you said. It could be a local action going down to your voter registration office or something of that nature. It could be some type of voter registration activity at a school or at the mall or whatever. It does not have to be historic in nature and historic in size in order for it to be impactful. Because guess what? If everybody on this call did an event and got 5 people, we do this all the time. We call it our 5 Friends Pledge. If everybody on this call touched 5 people and got them committed to taking action, and then guess what? If all those people then went out and each of them touched 5 people, and so on and so forth, then you have an army that can't be stopped. And it could be done that way with everybody just touching 5 people. We all know 5 people. We all know, we all got 5 friends, 5 coworkers, 5 people we like, maybe even 5 people you don't like. But we all got 5 people that we can touch, and we can spread this message about, you know what, voting rights is critical. We need to be taking action. When we go to the polls in this election cycle, we need to be thinking about voting rights. What can you do to help me go get 5 other people who can commit to coming out and voting, or commit to getting involved in the battle for voting rights? If it just starts that small, then you've done something. So you can do something where you are, reach out and touch 5 people, reach out and touch an organization that's doing this work, get connected with national groups. You can text us. If you text voting rights, one word, voting rights, to 25225, that'll get you connected to us, and we could get you some resources about voting rights, or even just about how to get registered, or how to tell somebody else that they could get registered. If everybody at our churches, at our places of faith, right, if we just use that as an organizing tool. And this is the last thing I'm gonna say on to this question, because this is a very practical point. A lot of our churches, a lot of our faith leaders are hesitant to get involved in some of these issues, right? I know the deal. I know you know the deal. A lot of them feel like, oh, I don't want to be, you know, I don't want to cross and lose my tax exempt status. I don't want to get accused of being partisan, right? And this is nothing new, right? There's always been some type of hesitancy. You know, our faith groups have always had this kind of double role of being, on the one hand, the leaders of our racial justice and social justice activism, but there's also been that other current that's been kind of resistant, you know, moderate, if you will. And let us not lose sight of the fact that when Dr. King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, he wasn't just talking to random people. He was talking to members of the clergy
Right.
who had told him that he needs to slow down, that they approve of his ends, but they didn't approve of his methods, right? So there's always been a little bit of a hesitancy within some aspects of our faith movements, right? We've got to confront that the same way that he confronted it in the letter from Birmingham jail. We've got to see if this is a moral call. You can't, if it's a moral call, if these are moral issues, then you can't tell me there's no role for our faith institutions to be involved. So even if what we do is just starting where we are in our faith, in our houses of faith, then that's a starting point, and that's a critical starting point, because again, our history shows us that when we involve our faith movement, we involve our churches, that there's nothing that our movements can't achieve. So get connected to an organization, do something through our faith institutions,
Right.
do something small right in your neighborhood, in your house, on your block. If we all do that and encourage 5 other people to reach out to 5 other people, our history shows us we can't be stopped.
Thank you. I do want to make it clear to those who are concerned or wondering, tax exempt status does not keep you from engaging in something like voting rights. What you're not
right.
allowed to do is to have a political party alignment.
That's
So you can even host, if you want to you can be a location for a town hall meeting, for instance, for your church and your community, long as you ensure that all parties are invited.
That's right.
You don't tell your people who to vote for, but it is
That's right.
completely inappropriate, because we do believe that voting is a moral issue, that
Mm-hmm.
they can actually register and vote. And that is an issue that is nonpartisan. So I just want to make that
Exactly.
particular point clear.
Exactly.
There's a lot to be said. I want to open it up right now, and then we can get back, if we have time, for questions. I apologize, I did not figure out exactly how we will do that with Cliff and I talking. Is there someone who can help us field questions that may be available that have been submitted? Okay, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to go forward, to look in the chat.
Yes. If there are people who have questions right now, please put them in the chat. In the meanwhile, Cliff, one thing that you also said that I think is extremely important, people tend to think of voting as an issue for Black people. It's a Black issue. And we know that until we all acknowledge Fannie Lou Hamer's famous statement that, no one's free until all of us are free.
Right.
It is the South African understanding of Ubuntu. We are community. And so could you talk a little bit about how this is not just a Black issue? And in the video that opened with the old Jim Crow, talked about divide and conquer. Voting is not just a Black issue, but until others see themselves impacted, it becomes a greater uphill battle, because it's looked at just as y'all's issue and not ours.
Right. No, that's a great question. And so it's important for us to think about that in 2 respects. On the one hand, the aspect of how it connects everybody in regards to voting itself, but also in regards to how the issues impact everybody. So on the first one, I think, even when you look at the things that a lot of these states are doing to attack voting rights, and to be clear, they are rooted in anti-Blackness, right? They're directed at Black voters. But as with most of racism, most of what starts off being rooted in anti-Blackness and targeted at us eventually becomes a cancer that infects the entire system. And so, you're trying to attack vote by mail because you're mad because Black voters came out in record numbers and used vote by mail and changed the outcomes in certain states. But the reality is that up until the pandemic, vote by mail had been used predominantly by the white community, and even more specifically in many of these states like Florida, has really been a tool by which Republicans have traditionally been able to turn elections, right? And so in attacking it, though, because they panicked, because of the way that Black voters came out, what they're doing is that they're actually harming even some of their own voters. When you take away drop boxes, when you take away 24-hour voting, when you take away days of early vote, what you're doing is you may be trying to target it, and sometimes they are able to target it, like in North Carolina, where the court said with surgical precision. But it's only a matter of time before that wound that you tried to have surgical precision on becomes an open wound that infects everybody. All right. And so everybody suffers when you decrease early voting days, when you take away drop boxes. Everybody suffers when you refuse to make, which is one of the provisions in the For the People Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, having Election Day be a national holiday. Like, who doesn't benefit from that? But because they are so focused on making sure that those Black people and those brown people, those young people and those marginalized people don't vote, they wind up impacting everybody. Many of the things that they're attacking, not only are they attacking folks who are marginalized because of race, but also, our disability community. is impacted by a lot of the things that they've been taking away, especially a lot of the Dropbox provisions. And so everybody winds up suffering by these things that they may have thought of as being rooted in anti-Blackness and may have meant to be that way, but it affects everything. The second thing that we have to think of, though, it's much like this battle going on in Florida with Disney, right? Here you are, you're trying to attack Disney because you don't like what they're saying about your don't say gay laws, and in attacking Disney, what you do now, you just created a tax increase on everybody in the state, right?
Exactly.
Hate isn't always not only is it not always intelligent, it's not always all that well focused, right? And so hate spills over and winds up impacting some folks that they didn't really intend for it to hurt, but it winds up hurting everybody. The other way that these policies wind up are an example about how we're all connected is because the policies that come into effect, even though they're rooted in anti-Blackness, they wind up impacting everybody. The attack on so-called critical race theory might be one of the best examples of that. Now you've got lumped under critical race theory. They've taken away books about women and gender equity. They've taken the books around sexuality. They're banning math books, y'all. And so again, things that are rooted in anti-Black books about the Holocaust, right? And so here you have something that is literally called critical race theory, or that they're trying to lump together as critical race theory. But here you have something that ostensibly is about race, but the books that they are attacking deal with everybody, any marginalized group or any group that does not fall under white male Christians with money. Which ironically were the same people who originally had voting rights in this country, right? But any group outside of that has become under attack in something that started based on race and white supremacy, but it spills over and winds up impacting everybody. So these are both examples about how what starts off as race, and is still based in race, is never exclusively limited to just us. It winds up impacting everybody. Everybody's impacted by this, and everybody's got a role to play in fighting against it and overcoming it.
Right. It's about justice and not just us.
That's right. That's right.
Some of the questions, and I'll kind of lump a couple of them together. The next session we're going to have is actually going to do an overview and understanding of what legislation is pending around voting. So you'll get a thorough understanding of that in the afternoon session and the call to action. So the other thing that someone mentioned, I just wanted to clarify again, that faith communities are the separation of church and state issue is around. The way I put it is that the separation of church and state was to protect us from the state, not the state from us.
That's right.
As citizens, we have the right, and as faith community, we have a right to advocate for issues that fall within our moral and ethical principles, but the state does not have the right to dictate our moral and ethical principles upon us. Okay.
That's right. And even if places of faith leaders don't want to get involved in the morality of some of the policy issues,
right?
Just engaging people in the process is there's never a risk to that, right? Exactly. In fact, it's an obligation that our places of worship, as places where people come and congregate, if that can't be a place to encourage people around how to empower themselves, because that's what the voting process is about, right? We want individuals and communities to be empowered. We want them to be engaged in the process, and even if you can't tell them how exactly that they need to vote, nobody can block your right to encourage people to be engaged and empowered through this process any more than they can block your right to encourage people to be empowered through their faith, right? And so there's absolutely no reason why faith leaders and houses of worship cannot be engaged and encouraging other folks to be engaged, to vote as they choose, to use their spirituality as a compass, but most importantly, to just be engaged. There can never be something wrong with doing that much.
Okay. Well, as usual, in great conversations like this, all good things must come to an end. I want to reiterate for the community, and correct me if I'm wrong, 2 things that people can do even now. Remember the 5 Friends Pledge. And that is something you can do before we even get done. Think of your 5 friends and then texting voting rights at 25225. All
Yep,
righty.
that's right.
Reverend
And
Mark.
remember, it's at the end of the day, it's about love, right? All of this
Yes.
is about love for ourselves, our communities, our families. You know, it's about love. As Dr. King, this is the last thing I'm gonna say, just really quick. You know, power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And where else is it more fitting for power to be used for love to implement the demands of justice, if not in our faith communities?
Amen, amen, and amen. Thank you, Reverend Alexander, for leading this important conversation, and to Brother Cliff for the work that you are doing to fight voter suppression and to ensure voter access. We thank you, particularly in the states where local governments are instituting Jim Crow 2.0. And because of this conversation, EAD advocates are now better equipped to become ground forces for justice and equity in the battle for ballots and representation. To EAD, we are not done yet. The Ask Plenary follows this session at 4:00 p.m. And we hope everyone, even those not planning to join us on the Hill tomorrow, will attend to learn more about the Ask. In just a few minutes, we will go back to the lobby to make our way to the Ask Plenary, but we have more excitement and engagement planned for the evening that we would like to share. There will be workshops offered from 7:30 to 8:15 p.m. to be inclusive of our global participants in other time zones, and our first ever AD by EAD Film Festival. Our features on screen will include 3 options: a voting rights short film feature, Otis' Dream, capturing an individual's tenacity in the fight to make his vote count; Moral and Safe, War, Peace, Drone Warfare in the Religious Community, exploring the impact of drone warfare from a faith perspective; and A Dangerous Idea, Eugenics, Genetics, and the American Dream. It is a documentary about the continuing eugenics use of genetic engineering. Now, rejoin us on the main stage here as EAD hosts a 4 to 5 o'clock p.m. Ask Plenary with Jose Santos Was from the Friends Committee on National Legislation and Jeff Abramson with the Arms Control Association, who will give background and information on our 2 legislative asks. These documents are also available to preview on the www.advocacydays.org website as downloadable attachments for the session and on the Lobby Day info tab in the Acela Events lobby. To join this next session, return to the Acela Events lobby, click on the Agenda tab, scroll down to the Ask Plenary session, and if you have not already done so, click on the bookmark feature to add it to your schedule. Join us there at 4 o'clock as we prepare for tomorrow on the Hill. Thank you again, Reverend Alexander and Brother Cliff. Wonderful conversation, and we look forward to conversations in the future. Keep up the good work. See you soon.
Thank you.